Hello, folks. We are back and hopefully gremlin free today, and we're going to leap straight in and continue yesterday's show. So my guest is Robin Pryor, the author of this new book and others, Conquer We Must, and we are talking about the 8th Air Force, the Bomber Command, Combined Bomber Offensive, and we'd got to 1942, I believe. So good evening, Robin. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. Free of gremlins today.
Yeah, it all seems good. So we got up to the point of the Americans arriving in the UK, the gradual, changing over of doctrine and things like that. So let's pick up from where we were. How did the American arrival affect, the Allied policy?
Yeah, this is a decision made at Casablanca, the combined bomber offensive. Roosevelt and Churchill sign off on it. The Americans are now going to bomb by day. And the British are going to continue to bomb by night, as they've been doing for a couple of years. What the Americans actually, the underlying assumption of the 8th Air Force doctrine is that they can hit by day what the British haven't been hitting by night. Their aircraft, the Flying Fortress in particular, will do what its name says it will do. It's a fortress. It's self-contained. It contains so many machine guns that it can shoot down anything that's sent against it. And as a result of that, daylight bombing becomes a real possibility. The British are terribly skeptical about this, from Churchill down to Portal, down to Bomber Command. They've had years of experience. On the other hand, they think if the Americans want to try this, why not let them?
Yeah, it's a good start. And this, we talked about it. Interesting that now we're a day later. We've had the show last night with Colin Kelly, where Colin was talking about the fact the 8th Air Force wasn't just involved with the precision daytime. They were experimented with night bombing. They experimented with area bombing as well. And I think over the years, it came up last night, as historians, we've kind of separated the two ways of doing it. The British solely doing nighttime area bombing, and the Americans solely doing daytime precision bombing. And of course, it's not as neat as that. And the two forces were exchanging ideas. There was rival ideas. There was different theories as to which one would be the one to take the war to Germany. But what we're interested in, of course, is your feelings about this and where you think things were going well in 1942 and what could have been done better, and just take us through your analysis of it.
It's certainly true that it's much more complicated than the Americans bombing by day and the British by night. The Americans tried some night bombing from Britain. They tried some daylight bombing from Britain. What they hadn't done, though, was venture very far into Germany. Some of their raids were, in fact, over France in 1942 and early 1943. What they relied on, though, was the Norden bomb site. This was going to revolutionise the way you bombed. They knew that the British hadn't been able to hit much that they'd aimed at from 1940 to 1942. The Americans were well aware of this, and the British actually made no secret of it in their joint staff talks. But the Americans felt this bomb site would revolutionise the war, and they would be able to bomb through cloud, which the British had told them repeatedly was a problem. They'd be able to bomb through smog, which was a big factor over the Ruhr, and so on. But certainly the Americans had tried night bombing, not very successfully, as the British had, and had then commenced day bombing, but day bombing mainly with very short range targets, France and so on, and into the western section of Germany. So 1943 was set up for, as we expected, for the Americans to bomb mainly during daytime and the British at night, round the clock bombing, Operation Point Blank. This would destroy the German war economy. Harris had long thought that. The Americans also thought that, but they thought their additional input would be the decisive factor.
Brilliant stuff. Now, I've put up on the image there of the major targets of the strategic bombing offensive, because one of the things that's really interesting is the limits of technology and also the positioning of the bases. We already had a question from Ian Carr about how did the planning of bases used by the US Army Air Force predate their entry into the war, and also how did the location of the airfields affect the targets as well, because the British system G wasn't good when you get the curvature of the earth because of the altitude. The as you say, the northern bomb site was hailed to be the most magnificent, thing, and it was okay, but it wasn't quite the wonder weapon that people said it was at the time.
No.
So in your interpretation of things, the target allocation, how did that resolve itself, and what were the different threads of arguments amongst the various sort of the people involved in this, the Churchills, the Portals, the later on the Akers, the Doolittles? What were the decisions and arguments that were going on?
Yeah, they're really. We have to think of Germany in two sections, as we did for so long after the Second World War. We have to think of West Germany and Eastern Germany. Western Germany really could be covered by British wizardry of one kind or another. G, then Oboe. It could cover the Ruhr. It could cover Western Germany. It could not cover Berlin and the east of the country. The curvature of the earth prevented these devices from working optimally in Eastern Germany. Yet the target selection often didn't fit in with those two parameters. The target selection often was in Eastern Germany because the Americans felt that's where the targets were. I mean, the most the one that's best known is the ball bearing factory, Schweinfurt. If you can knock out the ball bearings, you destroy the entire German war economy, all of which depends on ball bearings. So if we can knock out Schweinfurt, we can win the war. The trouble with Schweinfurt is it's too far east, and some of the navigation devices don't work. Where they work best is Western Germany, and where they work quite well, actually, is over the Ruhr, which is in Western Germany. It was in West Germany all those years before unification. It's also the prime industrial German target. There's a disconnect here somewhere between what the technology actually can do for the bomber crews and the targets that are chosen. And this is ignored to some extent by the British and to some extent by the Americans as well. They've got a problem with the range of their bombers. Most of them have to be based in East Anglia and Lincolnshire, or they can't get there with a bomb load and get back safely. So there's a disconnect there as well. It's an interesting thing between technology and what people want to do in their hearts, and there's quite a difference between those two in bombing.
I'm glad you mentioned that disconnect there, because one of the things that the subjects came up last night with Colin is the incredible PR job the 8th Air Force did during the war that's left its legacy with us now. Is that they talked about the things that were working well, and we talked about Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart and things like that, but they tend to not so much bury or hide the things that weren't going so well, but kind of conceal them among the stuff that was going well. And Bomber Command had its own PR type resources as well. We think of the Dam Busters raid in May 43 and things like that that were the highlights. And actually some of the things that weren't going so well were just not really talked about. And so as someone like yourself who studied both wars over quite a long time now, how burdened are we by some of this, the mythology of the way this history was told even back in the time?
Terribly burdened. I wrote a book once with a terrible subtitle of The End of the Myth. The myths never end. as I should have known when I wrote that book. That was Gallipoli, but there are myths surrounding Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force as well. The 8th Air Force, big myth being during daytime, they could do precision bombing with the Norden bomb sight. They could pick out particular factories. We've mentioned Schweinfurt. They could destroy those. They couldn't, actually. During the daytime, especially in 1943, plagued as they were by German fighters, they had difficulties that the British had during 1940, 41 and 42. Like not only could they not hit the Schweinfurt ball bearing factory, they couldn't hit Schweinfurt, even in daytime. The cloud, the Norden bomb site worked better, it turned out, in America under trial than it did in practice over Europe. There's a terrible mythology here that the Bomber Command were into area bombing and the 8th Air Force were into precision bombing. In fact, both of them were area bombing. It's just that the 8th Air Force kept saying they were precision bombing, and people at the time and since have believed them. Such is the force of myth and propaganda. So there's an enormous amount of this going around, that somehow the British were the indiscriminate bombers and the Americans were the precision bombers, when they were both, in terms we'd like to talk of today, they were both bombing indiscriminately to a large extent.
Well, that's exactly why you're here, Robin, to say that kind of stuff that needs to be said, because this is the fact we're burdened with. This is that there's this delineation between the two forces, and as we're finding this week, and you're continuing to explain, it's that they were operating in very similar ways. In many ways, they were encountering the same problems, maybe not the same era of the war, because the British were encountering some of the problems earlier, and the Americans encountered the same problems later in the war, but they're overcoming them in slightly similar ways, but also finding different techniques. And I've got that image up on screen now. So this is an image of the Bomber Command targets, and they're really concentrating on that rectangle there, the cities there. And the American one, I'll let you look at it first. So that's kind of showing you that Bomber Command is hitting one area, whereas the 8th Air Force one, this is June to December 43, is showing a much wider variety. It's showing the U-boat pens in Brittany. It's showing, all across Europe there. And again, it's not quite representative of what's going on. Bomber Command are doing all sorts of things all over the place. 8th Air Force are doing, as you say, these area bombings as well. So with this burden of how we think we perceive this history, where are we now in the historiography? Are we turning a corner? Are we beginning to look at these two, the combined bomber offensive, more objectively? Are we still stuck in our lanes?
I think we're still stuck. Something that one of the economic historians of the war, Adam Tooze, wrote struck me in particular. At the same time that this debate about area versus precision bombing is going on, the Bomber Command is getting much more accurate with its bombing. It's not so much bombing areas now in 1943, especially around the middle of that year. It is managing to hit particular targets. Now, it's been saying it can do this since 1940, but suddenly it can. And one of two of the major factors enabling it to do this are the pathfinders, these expert pilots who can lead the bomber stream onto a particular target and accurately mark that target with flares. That's one thing. And the other thing is a lot of these machines, especially the Mosquito, are equipped with oboe, which is much more accurate than G and able to be used in much more deleterious meteorological conditions. There's a continuous haze over the Ruhr. If it isn't cloud, it's smog. And oboe can see through that. So what we've got with Bomber Command suddenly is the ability to precision bomb. And Adam Tooze makes the point that the raids in the Ruhr conducted by Harris are devastating for German industrial capacity. 200,000 tons less steel is being produced at the end of these raids than at the beginning. The question here is, though, while the British are turning to precision bombing, perhaps Harris is not. He's got his list of cities and his blue pencil, which he crosses through cities, as though, of course, the city can't recover. I mean, Coventry could have been crossed through at one point, but then it comes back into production, as do a lot of German cities. It wasn't a matter of just, in other words, taking them out. It was keeping them out that was important. And at the very point that the British can do this stuff and maybe pulverize the Ruhr into a pulp for all time, they take their eyes off the Ruhr and turn them towards Berlin. This is one of the great ironies of the war, I think, because Berlin was beyond the range which Obo could operate. Yeah. You were back to an area campaign because that's all you could hit. Yes, you had heavier bombers now. You had Lancasters as well as Halifaxes and Stirlings, and they could deliver a much more potent bomb load to Berlin than had ever been delivered before. But in terms of picking out individual factories, oil plants and so on, A, Berlin wasn't where the action is, and B, you couldn't hit them anyway. So at the very time when the British had a stranglehold on the Ruhr, it seems to me, they turned their attention to Berlin. And of course, this is not really Harris's decision alone. It's wrong to think that. Harris, of course, wanted to do Berlin, but so did Churchill. After the Blitz, which British political leader wouldn't? And Churchill goes along with Harris's decision to operate against Berlin rather than the Ruhr. Bomber Command is not so big that it can do both at once. It has to make a choice, and Harris chooses Berlin, and Churchill agrees with him.
And that's all good, but we know that Churchill doesn't back the horse he doesn't want to. Churchill isn't cajoled or bullied into doing anything. No. Churchill must have agreed with Harris. Well, I've got Harris up on screen there now because he's an interesting figure. And I reread the chapter of your book 2 nights ago, and you make the point that Harris isn't the kind of commander who visits the bases. He doesn't go and talk to the pilots. He doesn't really give a shit about technology and what Obo and G can do. What he cares about is results. And as you say, this map where he kind of puts these lines through cities. And if you compare him, perhaps we can mention maybe Jimmy Doolittle later on. And Jimmy Doolittle, to me, seems much more of a hands-on. He goes to speak to people. He was in that Doolittle raid himself into Tokyo. He kind of embraces technology. I know you can't necessarily compare Harris and Doolittle like for like, but I want your opinions about Harris and what we're left with. Again, Colin Kelly last night on last night's show made the point that it's Harris's statue that regularly gets defaced with paint and things like that. And people don't do that to 8th Air Force monuments. So we have a huge legacy of public opinion about Harris. What is the Robin Pryor opinion about Harris? I mean, do you see merit in him? Are you kind of torn with him? Do you like him, dislike him? Give me your thumbnail sketch.
Harris is Haig.
Right.
He's the Haig of the Second World War. Now, there's a lot of things that follow from that. A lot of things. Haig correctly identified the Western Front in the First World War as the section where the war would be won or lost. Haig was right. Harris has a single-mindedness to him that reminds me of Haig. He's got his list of cities. He's going to cross them off. Nothing is going to stop him from that particular strategy. The blind spot is in the tactics. Haig can't see that he doesn't have a weapon of exploitation through most of the First World War. He's trying to send the cavalry through on the Somme. He's trying to do similar things at Passchendaele. And in November the 4th, 1918, what is he doing? he's massing the cavalry. The war's going to be over in a week, but Haig is behaving as he would have in 1915 or 16. Harris is much the same, I think, as that. Harris has this single-minded view: you destroy enough German cities, you will win the war. Churchill doesn't agree with the latter half of that. He doesn't think bombing is going to win the war. He knows he might have thought that in 1940. He certainly doesn't think it in 1942. And he certainly doesn't think it in 1943 or 4. He knows the invasion of Europe will have to happen sooner or later with land armies. So he's not going on with Harris all the way, but he does, I think, like Harris's single-mindedness. He is going to inflict damage on the Germans in a way that Britain, up until the Normandy invasion, can't. How can Britain cut its a role as a great power with the Russians and the Americans when Britain is so much smaller than both of those and so much weaker? It can cut a figure by the bombing campaign. This is what's important to Churchill. This is great power politics played out at a strategic level. The bomber offensive is Churchill's answer to Stalin when he says to Churchill, what is Britain doing to prosecute this war? It's his answer to Roosevelt when Roosevelt says, well, sooner or later, we're going to have three times the number of troops that you're going to have. Churchill can point to this enormous, single-minded, bloody-minded, if you like, determined commander, night after night, sending 400, 500, 600, 700 bombers over Germany, night after night after night, the figures of which are passed on to Stalin in a template form. Churchill has a template drawn up so he can say, we attacked X cities tonight and we dropped Y number of tons of bombs on them. So this is, I have some time for Harris in his single-mindedness. I have no time for him as a tactical commander. He loses the plot on the Ruhr. He either doesn't realise what Bomber Command is doing, or he does realise it and keeps it from Churchill, which is absolutely reprehensible. But I do have some time for him because he is one of the few people who is determined to prosecute this war to the bitter end.
No, he's definitely a what you see is what you get person. He's, he does what it says on the tin. He's got his objective. He's going to stick to that. He's unwavering in that mission, and rightly or wrongly, he commits to that, and you know where you are. And one of the things about the American personnel is they shift them around several times. The 8th Air Force has several commanders, and Acre came up in various conversations. Where's my Acre photo? Over this week, and he's gone by 1943 in whichever way you want to talk about it. Is he promoted upstairs? Is he shifted out of the way? Is he given a better command, a worse command? Everyone interprets that in different ways, but it seems maybe Harris hasn't got the right idea, but he has an idea, and he's damn well going to stick to it until it works. Whereas maybe in 43, the Americans haven't quite got their solutions sorted out yet, so they're trying different things, trying different commanders, and hoping. It's like a football coach, playing a different formation every week, eventually hoping that one of them is going to get the result. So the American commanders, because obviously your book is about the British and the Commonwealth at war. You don't touch on Americans. Were there comments that you would have put in your book about the American commanders if that had been within the remit and you had the space?
Yeah, I would have said there's a certain amount of delusion among the American command, which I think the Americans themselves realise in the end. They are suffering enormous casualties at times, casualties that make some of the bomber command things look like child's play. Yeah. They are really suffering from delusions that what they say they're doing is actually happening. There's always a danger when military people do this. They put forward a doctrine they then do operations entirely in contradiction of that doctrine, but say the doctrine's working anyway. Now, this is what too many American commanders of the 8th Air Force do, especially in 1943. They are really not in tune with what's going on the ground, which eventually the Americans themselves realised, hence the shuffling of commanders. They're not going to put up with this right through the war. Eventually, that they cannot keep doing these operations, or they will have to ground themselves, which at times they actually do. They cease operations altogether because their casualties have been so high. They are suffering a delusion that I think by 1943 the British don't have. They know these operations are going to be expensive, but the way they're doing them, especially with G and Obo, are within the parameters of acceptable casualties. The Americans are yet to realise that.
Bryn, I'd like to talk a little bit about Hap Arnold, if you don't mind. I know he's higher up, but in some ways I see a little bit of a correlation between him and Harris in that he does seem to have a clear idea about what he wants to do and is trying to kind of pass this message down. And again, as an Australian historian, what's your opinion of Arnold?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think he's a very Harris-like figure. I mean, the one thing that the Air Force chiefs can agree on, Harris and Arnold, is they don't want to do the transportation plan around the Normandy landings.
Right. Yeah.
That takes their aircraft away from Germany, and Arnold is as determined to bomb Germany as Harris. They're both at one on that, and it takes a great deal of political pressure and military pressure from Eisenhower on up to Churchill and the War Cabinet to persuade Arnold and Harris to get back to ground operations in northern France. Neither of them wants to do it. There's an interesting remark actually in Tedder's memoirs with Prejudice, where he says that Harris is exaggerating the number of casualties that he will cause to the French in bombing regarding the transportation plan deliberately. He knows the figures are false. This is Tedder's view, but he's doing it because he doesn't want to do it at all. He wants to get back to bombing Germany. Whether that's the case or not, I must say, it hadn't occurred to me when I wrote my book. I've just read that bit now, and maybe I'd put a footnote to that effect in. But maybe Harris is exaggerating the casualties, the French casualties. Churchill thinks that 100,000 French people will be killed in the transportation plan, and he's saying to all concerned, including Harris and Arnold, that this is unacceptable. Now, it may have been a ruse on the part of those Air Force generals, the bomber barons, to get back to Germany. It didn't work, of course. Eventually, Roosevelt makes the decision that this will go ahead, whatever number of French casualties are caused. Roosevelt not caring particularly about French casualties, by the way.
Well, that's another whole subject. I think that's what we talked about last time. And I've done shows with Professor Stephen Bork about the transportation planning of the bombing of France. And for an American historian, he's very, very scathing of the American plan particularly. And it brings up a better question another question to ask you, Robin, which is this. The fact is that the Royal Air Force is the junior service in the UK, and that the US Army Air Force is part of the Army. So they're not yet got their own identities. They are having to go and do things that perhaps they don't want to do. And it takes us away a little bit. Harris, as you said there, and Arnold, they are persistent about we must take the war to Germany. Now, whether or not precision or area bombing is actually hitting the targets, one thing you can say is that it's constantly putting that stress on the Luftwaffe. It's putting that stress. The Germans have to put the aircraft up to try and stop it. They have to expend anti-aircraft ammunition. They're using the fuel they're using for the aircraft. So if you keep on with it, even if it's not actually having its primary purpose of hitting targets, it's putting that strain on the German Air Force. If you take unit 8th Air Force or Bomber Command units away and you start bombing France or U-boat pens, you're softening that blow on Germany. So do you think that was a mistake to spread out and use Bomber Command and 8th Force for the 8th Air Force for these other things, and it's just sort of diluting what they were good at?
I'm keeping an open mind. My next book's on Normandy.
Right.
I'm keeping an open mind on the transportation plan and how successful it was, but it certainly has its critics. What the 8th Air Force in particular, though, in the early months of 1944 are doing is destroying the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
I mean, finally, thanks partly to the British, the Americans have got a long-range fighter. I'm talking about the P-51 Mustang, which, when fitted with Rolls-Royce engines, proved to be an excellent long-range fighter. But the Americans also had the Lightning before then. And what they can now do is escort the bomber stream over Germany to such an extent that it almost doesn't matter what the bombers hit. I mean, they're still hitting not very much. But what's happening is the Luftwaffe is coming up to defend the Reich, and they're being shot out of the air by these high-performance, long-range fighters. What Harris and Arnold are, in fact, accomplishing is one of the preconditions for the Normandy landing, that the Luftwaffe be weakened to the extent that it can't decisively intervene in that operation. It's almost happening by accident, actually. This is not what the Americans are intending to do, but it's what's happening over Germany between January and May 1944. At the end, the German fighter force in particular is just a shadow of what it's been even in 1943. So by this strange sort of misguided strategy in a way, they achieve for Normandy better results possibly than the transportation plan ever achieved.
That's a really good point, and I will have to bring you back on in the future when you've done your Normandy book to talk about that transportation plan. And of course, it's not like there's different parts of transportation plan. There's the hitting of the marshalling yardings ahead of the invasion, but then there's that interdiction after the invasion to try and stop German reinforcements getting to Normandy. And I think the second part for me works better than the first part. But that's another whole subject for the day. It'd be delightful to do a panel discussion about that at some point. But I want to go back to your point there about some of the results the bomber offensive are getting are not even the ones they're necessarily intending. As you say, this drain on the Luftwaffe isn't really the main intention, although it does kind of shift to becoming the main intention. And that's one of the things that when we're back to people like Acre and Doolittle, that sometimes they've been given credit for things that or Doolittle has perhaps, that may not have been as their influences. It was the German effects that were having. The Germany was struggling to get its aircraft in the air, which was coinciding with some gradual improvements from the American and British side. So they're kind of attributing this better success to what they were doing, when in fact it was actually the enemy that was sort of contributing. I think I made some sense in my point there. It didn't come out as well as it did in my head.
It's a fact. I mean, from after the Battle of Britain, what the British have been trying to do is entice the German fighters into the air so they can destroy them. It's clear from the Battle of Britain that the Spitfire in particular and the later marks of the Spitfire are a superior plane. All you've got to do is entice the Germans to come up and we'll shoot them out of the air. The problem with that in 41 as a strategy, those sweeps over northern France, is the Luftwaffe wouldn't play. They knew quite well what they could do and what they couldn't do. What the Americans have done in 1944 is, of course, happening not over northern France and Belgium, but over the Reich. They have no alternative but to defend the Reich. At last, you've got a situation where the Luftwaffe have to come up. They have to send up their fighters. That's been very successful for the Luftwaffe up until now because the bombers have been unescorted. Now you've got these long-range fighters that are not only long-range, they're high performance as well. I mean, the Mustangs in particular can shoot whatever Mark 109s the Germans send up against them, let alone anything inferior to that. This is not calculated, it seems to me, by any air commander, be they American or British. It's what happens, though. Maybe the Americans by March or April 1944 are realizing what's happening and increase, I think, their fighter protection in those months by a certain to a certain extent, so they can shoot even more of the Luftwaffe down. But it's not an intended consequence. It's one of those things in war that happens, and you achieve your purpose of putting the Luftwaffe in its place by an accidental strategy designed entirely to do something else. I mean, the Americans are still trying to hit Schweinfurt and knock out those pesky ball bearing factories. They're still not quite managing to do it, but what they are doing is wiping out the Luftwaffe and especially its fighter arm. This not only affects the Western Front, of course, it affects the Eastern Front as well.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Eastern Front, because that's been coming up in the sidebar, is that we're talking today predominantly from a Western point of view because we're talking about the 8th Air Force. But I've put the map up on the screen there. It's showing the range of US heavy bombers. So there's the ones missions from Italy, there's missions from Russia and things now. And you can see towards the end of the war that the poor old Luftwaffe, and I don't have any sympathy for them, are being hit from all directions as the ranges increase, the technology increases, the bomb size increases, the payload increases. They're just being hit from all sides there. So although I am doing this series of shows called the 8th Air Force Week, and I did a first week, I'll do a second week, and I'll probably do another week when Masters of the Air, the TV series, comes out, we are all a little bit guilty of focusing on the 8th Air Force and not talking about the 15th Air Force and the other air forces, and you know, that should get equal attention. And it comes back to this idea of the 8th Air Force having at the time and since a really, really good PR department. It is the Air Force people talk about. And that means we're not looking at the East. So, you know, you've studied the whole war and the First World War as well. You need to look at the West and the East together, isn't it? Nothing happens in a vacuum. So when we're looking at the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command, have you got any comments to make about what's happening from the East as well and how that's influencing things?
Yeah. I mean, for a start, you're right about the 15th Air Force. No one knows about it. Yet they took out the Romanian oil fields almost single-handedly. No one knows about that much either. What we know about the 15th Air Force is that they are the subject of Catch-22. I'm afraid they're stuck with that.
My favourite book of all time, I have to say. My favourite fiction book,
Yes, they're probably stuck with that image for forever. But I mean, the other thing that's happening here because let's face it, most of the bombing of Germany is done by Allied British and American aircraft. It's distorting the German war economy. Every time you put an anti-aircraft gun up to defend the Reich, that's an 88 that can't knock out a tank on the Eastern Front. That 88 needs bombs, it needs gun sights. Every time you do that, you may be hampering your ability to build periscopes for submarines. There's a very good article by Roger Beaumont, a historian I knew, called The Bomber Offensive as a Second Front. And it makes all these points that what the bomber offensive is doing by forcing the Germans to defend the Reich with anti-aircraft guns, with producing bomb sites and so on, is distorting the German war economy in ways it wouldn't have gone otherwise. This is a very important, yet I think little known factor in the air war. All of this bomber offensive is to that extent aiding the Russians in the East, especially with the 88s. I mean, the biggest tank destroyer of all time is the 88, and if they're pointing upwards instead of horizontally against tanks in the east, then you are assisting the Russians. The Russians have never acknowledged this, needless to say, but I think sometimes the proponents of the bomber offensive have forgotten it as well.
That's a good point. Well, we'll do some questions now, if you don't mind, because there are some good ones coming in. And the first one is about, I've got to find it there, from it's tonight's guest. In fact, Yost is going to be on later talking about one of the missions, but he's saying about the terms of precision and area or carpet bombing. Are we, when we write about them or talk about them, are we talking about them in what they meant during the World War II or what they mean today? And language is very important. It comes up a lot on this channel, is what is meant by terms like elite or, they're very subjective terms and everyone has a different idea in it. So that's a very good question I'd like to put to you, that what we refer to as precision bombing today, because we can watch those war films where they put some flare out and a missile comes in the exact window the officer demands it to and explodes behind the couch in an apartment building. That's today's precision bombing. So the labeling, are we a bit misunderstanding about what those terms meant then and what they mean now?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, especially reading the Defense Committee minutes and the War Cabinet minutes. I don't think area bombing as an expression is ever mentioned. It's all about hitting the German industrial workers close to the factories that you're actually aiming at. If you can't hit the factories, you may be able to dehouse, and that was not used by a member of the War Cabinet until 1942, and it's Lord Cherwell who uses it, dehouse the German workers. The dancing around the term area bombing that's done in committee is quite spectacular to read. We know what they're talking about. They're talking about the inability to hit anything but a city, but they're very careful in the language that they use. And in fact, the War Cabinet that authorises all-out area bombing, Churchill's not present for reasons I can't work out. I've never been able to work out. He's not there. It's not because it's not his policy, though. It is his policy, and it's what the War Cabinet are considering. But the dancing around of this term is quite spectacular. The fact is that the bombing done in the Second World War was mainly almost all area bombing. At times, you could hit what you aimed at. I've pointed to the British at the Ruhr being able to take out the Krupp works, which they did. But most of the bombing that's done is area bombing. It's you drop a bomb and you hope it hits Berlin or Hamburg or wherever, and that's about the best you can do.
And again, it came up last night that there are these incredible moments of precision bombing, and not necessarily by Bomber Command or the units we're talking about, but things like the Amiens prison and Chastised, Dam Busters. There were these exceptional examples from Americans, British, Canadians, and others of these really, really, really good raids, 9th Air Force, 2nd Tactical Air Force, but they aren't necessarily the majority of them. As you say there, the point is a lot of it was area bombing. But we've got a question from Pat, a regular viewer.
Yeah.
How effective for German civilian morale was the Hitler rule that most engagement should take place over Germany? The idea being that the civilians should see the shooting down of Allied bombers. Was that a good idea by the Germans or a bad one? And what difference did that make?
It's a terrible idea. If that was their idea, it's an absolutely dreadful one. Because if the bombers are over Germany, they're dropping bombs on it. I think it was Goering who said, if a single Allied plane appears over Germany, you can call me Meyer. Well, there must have been a lot of people calling him Meyer. Now, that's an absolutely awful propaganda tool if that was the case, because in relation to the total strength, not many actually bombers were shot down, a fraction of the force that was sent each night. And for another thing, especially with the British, they were shot down at night where probably hardly anyone noticed. They're being down below in air raid shelters.
No, good point. I'm just checking out the other questions there. As an Australian who perhaps gets to Europe less frequently than some people do, when we're talking about the 8th Air Force, weather, it came up yesterday. I don't think some of the American commanders just have a grip on how bad the weather can be in Northern Europe. And that, you going back to Northern Bomb Site, the tests being done, when they could see targets, navigation was an issue, everything's nice. And you get into Europe and it's fog and rain and shit and wind and stuff.
Yeah.
Was that with hindsight something that the Americans should have had a better grip on, in just how shitty the weather is in Europe?
Yes, I think so. I think so. I mean, only an Australian tourist can, in Europe, which I've been many times, can tell you how bad the weather is over there at times, and at times in midsummer, I might add.
The amount of June anniversaries here in June in D-Day when it's been shitty weather, I think outnumber the good weather ones. I look back on my photos of each year, and there's so many years I seem to be huddled around in waterproofs and waterproof trousers trying to commemorate an event on June the 6th, 44. Yeah, have been some sunny ones, but there have been some really grim ones. But as you say, that's a summer as well. So yeah, I think the weather is a consideration.
Yeah, I was in Normandy during the second half of June and July some years ago, and often we couldn't go out until 11 o'clock because the mist hadn't lifted.
Yeah,
and
know that one.
Yeah, it was something that we hadn't expected at all. And you thought, oh, people were fighting in these conditions. This is pretty bad. And also, we got some pretty violent rainstorms at times. Especially in July. So, yeah, I think the Americans did not take this into account. It's rather like, to what extent did the British and Americans take the bocage into account in the Normandy invasion?
Yeah, that's another rabbit hole to go down. But yeah, fascinating discussion. We've got a question from Dean Murphy, who's down in your part of the world, about did the Allies ever consider using biological agents?
Not as far as I know. They considered using gas on many occasions. Churchill, in fact, thought gas would be the appropriate response to the V1s and the V2s. He was talked out of it by the experts fairly easily, I might say, when they pointed out what a blunt instrument this would be, how few casualties would actually be caused by gas. But he certainly contemplated it seriously. He writes to Brooke about it. He writes to Portal. It doesn't go any further. But as far as biological weapons are concerned, I can't think of a single case. Yes, I am thinking of something. Yes. They were going to try and bomb the Black Forest with some sort of device that would that may have had a biological component, but it was soon ruled out of court. Serious consideration never given to it.
Thank you. And we will wind things up while we're gremlin free today in a few minutes. But I want to know if there's anything else you think should be being talked about when we talk about the combined bomber offensive. Again, are we stuck in some certain narratives and lanes? Where do you think research should go, or what should we be talking about, or what shouldn't we be talking about? With your years of experience, give us some insight into what we're doing wrong.
I certainly think some of the points Adam Tooze brings up in the Wages of Destruction could use further investigation. He is suggesting, and I think highly of his work, he is suggesting that the bomber offensive had a greater impact on the German war economy than has previously been thought. I think, and he's got material there. He's got documents. I mean, you'd have to be a German speaker and reader to do it, but I think that's one thing that ought to be done. I mean, it's a bit like the blockade in the First World War. What effect did it have on the Germans? We probably never know because a lot of the documents from that period have been destroyed. Yep. Tooze has got enough stuff that indicates to me that the documents to further study this point in the Second World War are still existing. So I think that should be followed up as well. The other thing I suppose I would like to get beyond with the bomber war is Dresden, something we haven't yet mentioned.
Well, let's go to Dresden then. For we might as well talk about. I mean, again, I've considered doing a specific show about Dresden with one or other of the historians and things, and it's the reason I haven't done it yet is I think everyone will just come on this as viewers with their idea of what they think about it, that it was a war crime or that it was the best thing the British ever did or whatever, and they will not be swayed from the whatever it is they think, and it's almost pointless having a debate because people are so entrenched with their opinions. But you mentioned it, so it's your fault, Robin. Dresden, disassemble it for me in a few minutes. What your thoughts are about it?
It's the Gallipoli of Bomber Command. There are so many myths. The fact is that when Dresden was bombed, the Germans were far from giving up. It was a target, long been a target for Bomber Command. The fact that they eventually got around to it, partly at the behest of the Russians, but partly, I must say, because it was still on Harris's list, is not exceptional. The casualties caused were not exceptional. A lot of the fuss has come from misinformation, which predates the internet, I might add, and can be easily disseminated through books, talks, and other ways, and was partly from David Irving, but partly from others as well who wanted to hear the lesson David Irving thought he was telling, i.e. that this was a war crime. It wasn't a war crime. It was an operation in among many towards the end of what we now know was the end of the Second World War. This is a big thing, I think. February 1945. We did not know the war was going to end in May, the war in Europe. And I think a lot of the writing about Dresden suffers from that point, that we now do know it and we think, well, the war could have been won without it. That's not what they thought at the time.
That's a really good point. We measure it back from VE Day as opposed to looking at it about what was happening in the winter of 44, 45. And when I've done shows about the attacks into Germany in early 45, it was very bleak times. I mean, desertions were rife in the American and British armies. Morale was at an all-time low. The Canadians in the Scheldt Estuary, etc., etc. Some of those campaigns going to Germany were tough fought. We're doing one about next week about the British 12th Corps pushing into Germany. Hard fought, nasty campaigns, Germans defending bridge by bridge, village by village. It was a bleak time that the end was not in sight like it appears to be now. It seems to be, D-Day, a year later, VE Day. And it wasn't that simple at the time. And Dresden, as you so correctly say, is caught in that idea of, say, measuring it back from VE Day and say, it came really close to the end of the war. Well, the end of the war did end up coming quite suddenly at the last bit, a bit like the Falaise Gap in Normandy.
Yeah.
The last few weeks did speed up a little bit. And Dresden is a subject I will do at some point, but my God, it's a contentious one, and people have their opinions, rightly and wrongly. I was there was something else I was going to ask you, but I've forgotten what it was there. But it was it'll come to me in a minute. But the strategic bombing offensive. There is more. I know it's about Adam too. As I was going to ask you. The other thing it's come up in the sidebar today, Robin, is the idea, because certain German documentation says that production went up in 44, just as when you were saying things like the effectiveness against the Ruhr, the bombing is starting to hit its target. There does seem to be this suggestion that German production is going up. Now, is it going up, or is it the Germans cooking the books, do you think?
I think I'm going to quote from Adam Tooze here from his Wages of Destruction. For the armaments effort as a whole, the German armaments effort, the period of stagnation lasted through the second half of 1943. As Speer himself acknowledged, Allied bombing had negated all plans for a further increase in production. Bomber Command had stopped Speer's armaments miracle in its tracks.
Right.
That is pretty definitive, but I would like to see more work done on that particular aspect of the bomber offensive. What we need is a military/economic historian to take this further.
No, definitely. I mean, I had Adam on my channel about a year ago, and he was amazing because he didn't really do any preparation for it. It's all in his head. He was walking around his house on his mobile phone, just this stream of consciousness that I was struggling to keep up with because he's really, really sharp and really, really good. And he was actually packing his daughter's belongings to move house. I mean, he just gave me an hour in the middle of his kind of hectic time, and I was like running alongside a steam train trying to keep up with this incredible stuff coming out of his head there. But I would invite Adam back. And last night's show with Colin Kelly was interesting because he's going through these thousands and thousands of documents that exist in the archives in America about 8th Air Force, and that's where he found lots and lots of references to these secondary targets and third targets and targets of opportunity that are essentially, as you said there, they're area bombing. They're not precision bombing, and it's there in the evidence. And so as the archives get digitalized, as a new generation of historians know how to look at those documents and pull out the information, I think we will start having some reassessments of the combined bomber offensive and maybe some new evaluations of it. But we will bring the things to an end, stop on a high while the connections are working. Just because you whetted my appetite, Normandy, what's I know you said you're working on it. What's your angle for when you're going to hit the Normandy beaches with your book?
Well, I've read a couple of books, a few books on the subject, and what some of the books say is that the German fighting man was much better than any other, that their machine guns were better, that their tanks were better, that their organizational structure of command groups, battle groups, was better. And the only conclusion you can draw from some of this material, most of it written by British and American historians, is that the Germans won. But of course, the Germans didn't win. In fact, one of the titles I'm playing around with for my book is 11 weeks in another country, because that's all it took from June the 6th to August the 20th for the Allies to prevail. 11 weeks. The Somme had hardly got going in 11 weeks. I mean, give me a break. The Allies must have been
loving
doing
you even
something
more,
right.
Robin, because I have always been this idea that when people start saying, oh, why did the Normandy campaign take so long? I go, but it came out under schedule, with fewer casualties, with greater destruction of the German army than we could have possibly have imagined. Everything, how can you refer to Normandy as anything but a really good success? Sure, there were things where we could have improved things. Sure, that's war. There's always that.
That's war.
In football, you can always get a 5th goal and a 6th goal and a 7th goal. But if you win the game 3-0, you've won the game 3-0. That's it. And to me, Normandy is a back of the net victory. And the people who say, "Oh, it was," they just get on my nerves. But we'll invite you back for that, Robin, and talk and thrash out Normandy one day. That'll be really good.
Absolutely, Paul.
Brilliant. Well, thanks talking to you, folks. I'll see you all again tonight with Yost. And thank you for watching. And we cured the gremlin. So thank you very much, Robin. You will get another invitation to come back on. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for WW2TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Paul.